My name is Delia Mensah, and I am 29 years old, and I am sitting at table 7 of my sister's wedding reception in a cream dress I bought for myself and paid for myself. And I am holding a glass of wine that I have been drinking slowly and carefully for the past 40 minutes. And I am smiling in the way that I have learned to smile at family gatherings, which is with my whole face and with none of myself. And my sister, Sienna, is dancing with her new husband in the middle of the room, and she is beautiful in the way she has always been beautiful, which is effortlessly and publicly, and in a way that fills whatever room she is in. And I am watching her, and I am thinking about a document that is sitting in a solicitor's office in the city. And I am thinking about a date that is 730 days from now. And I am smiling. My father stood up at 7:15 to give his speech. He is a man who gives speeches the way he does most things, which is with great confidence and great pleasure in his own confidence. And he spoke about Sienna, and about her husband Daniel, and about the kind of love that builds a life. And then he paused in the way he pauses when he wants the room to understand that what comes next is significant. And he said that he and my mother had been thinking very carefully about what to give their daughter as a wedding gift, and that they had decided that no object and no amount of money could express what they wanted to express, and that what they wanted to give Sienna was the thing that mattered most, which was stability and foundation and a place to build everything that came next. He said they were giving her the family home. The room responded the way rooms respond to gestures of this size, which was with the specific sound of 200 people being moved simultaneously. And my mother was crying in the way she cries at things she has planned, which is beautifully and with full awareness of how she looks when she cries. And Sienna put her hand over her mouth and looked at my parents with an expression that I have seen on her face my entire life, which is the expression of a person who expected something wonderful and received it and is experiencing the confirmation that the world is exactly as generous as she had always believed it to be. I sipped my wine. My father looked at me from the podium. He said that he wanted to acknowledge Delia, who had always been the independent one, and who had built her own life with her own hands, and who had never needed the kind of support that some children need, and that he and my mother were proud of her in the way that you are proud of a person who requires nothing from you, which is comfortably and from a distance. And he said that he knew Delia would understand. I raised my glass. I smiled with my whole face. I said, "Congratulations to my sister," across the room, and Sienna blew me a kiss and went back to being the center of everything, which is where she has always been most comfortable. And I sat at table 7 with my wine and my smile, and I thought about Rose. My grandmother Rose died 4 years ago at the age of 81 in the house she had lived in for 53 years, which is the same house my father announced to 200 wedding guests tonight. And she was a woman who said very little and observed everything, and she had watched my parents for 40 years with the specific attention of a woman who loves her son and has no illusions about him. And she had watched the way they moved through the world and the way they moved through their children. And she had understood the architecture of the family in the way that grandmothers understand things, which is without being told and without needing to be. She called me to the house 2 years before she died. I was 25 and she was 79. And we sat in the kitchen where she had always done everything that mattered. And she made tea and she placed a document on the table and she said that she wanted me to read it. And I read it. And when I finished, she said that she had spoken to her solicitor the previous week and that everything was in order, and that I should keep a copy somewhere safe, and that I should not tell my parents. And I looked at her across the kitchen table, and I understood that she had been watching for a long time and had decided what to do about what she had seen. The document was a trust deed. It established a discretionary trust over the family home with me as the sole beneficiary, and it contained a single maturity clause, which was my 30th birthday, and it had been signed and witnessed and registered, and it was as legal and as permanent as anything I have ever held in my hands. And my grandmother looked at me over her tea and said that she knew I would know what to do with it, and that I should take my time. I took 2 years. I watched my parents make their plans, and I said nothing. And I watched Sienna get engaged, and I said nothing. And I watched the invitations go out, and I said nothing. And I sat at table 7 on a Saturday in June, and I watched my father give a speech about a house that had belonged to me since my grandmother signed a document in a solicitor's office 4 years ago. And I said nothing. And I sipped my wine, and I smiled, and I counted the days, 730 days from that Saturday. 730 days of Sienna choosing paint colors and knocking through walls and sending me photographs of the renovations with captions about how much she loved her home, and 730 days of my mother telling mutual friends how generous she and my father were, and how settled Sienna was now, and how Delia was fine because Delia had always been the strong one on the morning of my 30th birthday. I woke at 6 and I made tea and I sat at my kitchen table and I thought about Rose and I thought about a document in a solicitor's office and I thought about 730 days of silence and I picked up my phone. My mother called at 9:14. She was not crying the way she cried at the wedding. She said my name at a volume that I had not heard from her before, and she said, "What have you done?" And I looked out of my kitchen window at the morning, and I said, "Good morning, Mum." And I said that I had just turned 30. I want to tell you about the quality of my mother's voice on the phone that morning because I think it is important to describe it accurately. And what it was not simply anger and was not simply distress and was the specific sound of a person whose understanding of the world has just been reorganized without their permission and who has not yet decided how to respond to the reorganization except loudly. And my mother has always been a person who responds to the unexpected loudly because loudness has always worked for her in the past, and she had not yet understood that it was not going to work. This morning, she said that Sienna had received a letter. She said it had been delivered by a courier at 8:45, which was 29 minutes before she called me, and she said that the letter was from a firm of solicitors and that it was addressed to Sienna and Daniel, and that it described itself as a notice of change of registered proprietor, and that it informed Sienna that the property in which she was currently residing had transferred by operation of trust to a new registered owner, and that the new registered owner would be in contact regarding the future of the occupancy arrangement. And she said all of this at a volume that I held the phone slightly away from my ear to accommodate, and I sat at my kitchen table, and I drank my tea, and I listened to all of it. Then she said, "What have you done to your sister?" I said good morning again, because I had said it once already, and she had moved past it, and I thought it deserved a second attempt. She said that this was not a morning for pleasantries, and that her daughter had just received what amounted to an eviction notice on a property that she and my father had given to her as a wedding gift, and that she wanted to know how I could do this to my own family. And I said that I wanted to explain something to her, and I said it in the voice I use when I want someone to hear what I am actually saying, rather than what they are expecting me to say, which is quiet and level and slower than my normal register. I said that you cannot give something you do not own. I said it once and I let it sit in the space between us on the phone, and my mother said that they absolutely owned that house, and that it had been the family home for 30 years. And I said that the family home had been registered in my grandmother's name until her death, and that at the point of her death, it had not passed to my father through the estate, but had transferred into a trust that my grandmother had established 4 years before she died, and that the trust had been registered with the land registry at the time of its creation, and that my father had never appeared on the title register of that property, and that therefore the gift he had announced to 200 people at my sister's wedding had been a gift of something that did not belong to him. There was a silence. It was not a long silence. My father took the phone. My father's voice when he is angry is different from my mother's voice when she is angry, in the way that two kinds of weather are different and both are unpleasant. And his voice drops rather than rises. And it becomes deliberate in the way that voices become deliberate when the person speaking them wants you to understand that they are accustomed to being the most significant presence in any conversation. And he said my full name, which is what he does. When he wants me to understand that he is speaking to me as my father, and not as a person I might consider negotiating with. And he said that he did not know what I thought I was doing, but that he had spoken to a solicitor of his own some time ago when my grandmother had first raised the idea of a trust, and that he had been advised that a trust of this nature could be challenged on the grounds of undue influence, given my grandmother's age at the time of signing, and that he would be pursuing that challenge through the courts, and that I should understand that this was not over, and that he had resources, and that he was not a man who accepted this kind of treatment from his children. I said that Mr. Vance would be happy to hear from his solicitor. I said that the trust had been reviewed by 2 independent legal professionals at the time of its creation, and that my grandmother had been 79 and in full possession of her faculties, and that she had, in fact, prepared a statement of capacity signed by her GP at Mr. Vance's recommendation, which had been kept with the trust documents specifically in anticipation of a challenge of the kind my father was describing, and that Mr. Vance had registered the new title in my name at 9 that morning, which was the first thing he had done on the first working day following my 30th birthday, and that the registration was complete and recorded, and that a challenge to the trust would need to be filed before a court would consider any interim order affecting the title, and that interim orders of that kind in cases involving properly executed and registered trusts were not commonly granted, and that his solicitor would likely tell him the same thing. My father said that I was being vindictive. I said that I was being precise. I said that I would be at the house at 11 and that I wanted to inspect the property and that I would expect to have access and that I would be bringing Mr. Vance's representative with me, and that I thought it would be sensible for Sienna and Daniel to begin thinking about their arrangements because I would be writing to them formally within the week regarding the timeline for the change of occupancy. And I said that I hoped we could handle all of this in a way that was straightforward and that I was happy to be reasonable about the timeline as long as the cooperation was mutual. My mother came back on the line. She said that I had always been cold. I said that I loved them both and that I would see them at 11. I ended the call. I finished my tea. I washed the mug and dried it and put it back in the cupboard, and I picked up my keys and my bag, and I picked up the folder that Mr. Vance had sent to me by courier the previous afternoon, which contained the registered title confirmation and the trust deed and the capacity statement, and 3 other documents that I hoped I would not need to use but had brought, because I have always found it better to carry what you might need than to wish you had it. And I went downstairs, and I got into my car. I sat in the car for a moment. I thought about my grandmother Rose, sitting in her kitchen at 79 with a document on the table and a cup of tea and the specific expression of a woman who has decided something and is at peace with the decision. And I thought about what she had seen over 40 years of watching my parents, and what she had understood, and what she had done about it quietly and legally and without drama. And I thought that the least I could do was arrive at her house with the same quality of stillness that she had always brought to the things that mattered. I started the car. I pulled out into the morning. The house was 20 minutes away. I had been waiting 2 years for this drive. I took my time. The house looked smaller than I remembered, and I want to tell you that this always happens when you return to a place that was large in your childhood and has been scaled by the years to its actual dimensions. And I sat in the car for a moment on the opposite side of the road, and I looked at it, and I thought about 53 years of my grandmother living inside it. And I thought about the kitchen where she had made the tea and placed the document on the table, and I thought about the specific quality of her stillness in that kitchen, which was the stillness of a person who has done what needed to be done and is no longer afraid of the consequences, because the consequences have been accounted for. I could see my father's car in the driveway. I could see Sienna's car behind it. I picked up my folder and I got out. I want to tell you about the walk up the path because I think it matters. And what I noticed as I walked was that the front garden had been changed, and the rose bushes that my grandmother had kept along the left side of the path for as long as I could remember had been removed and replaced with something low and architectural that I did not recognize, and the path itself had been relaid in a different material. And I looked at these things as I walked, and I noted them, and I kept walking. The door opened before I reached it. My father was standing in the frame, and his face had the color it gets when he has been managing his anger for a period of time and has not been entirely successful. And my mother was behind his left shoulder, and Sienna was behind his right shoulder. And Sienna had been crying in the way she had always cried, which was completely and without apparent concern for how it appeared, and she was still crying when the door opened, and I looked at the three of them and I said good morning. My father said that he wanted me to understand that this was not going to go the way I thought it was going to go. I said that I would like to come inside. Please, he said that this was still his family's home. And I said that I understood he felt that way, and that Mr. Vance's office had provided me with a copy of the updated title register that morning, and that I was the registered proprietor as of 9 a.m., and that I would like to come inside and look at the property, and that I was happy to do this respectfully and calmly, and that I hoped he would extend me the same. He stepped back. I'm not sure he meant to. And I think his body made the decision before his intention caught up with it. And I walked through the door into the hallway of my grandmother's house, and I stood in it, and I looked at it. The hallway had been repainted the color my grandmother had kept for 30 years, which was a particular shade that I had always thought of simply as her color was gone, and the walls were now a pale gray that was fashionable and impersonal. And the mirror that had hung at the end of the hallway since before my father was born was gone. And in its place was a print in a frame that I did not recognize. And I stood in the hallway and I looked at these things, and I felt something that I want to describe accurately, which was not grief exactly and was not anger exactly, and was the specific cold feeling of seeing something that belonged to someone you loved being unmade by people who did not understand what they had. Unmade. Sienna said, "My name." She said it the way she has said my name since we were children, which is as the opening note of a larger performance. And then she said that I was a thief and that what I was doing was disgusting, and that she and Daniel had spent thousands on this house, and that she had spent 4 months choosing the kitchen. and that she had designed the garden herself, and that she had done all of it for her family and for her future children, and that I was standing in her home trying to take it from her, and that no piece of paper changed what kind of person I was. I let her finish. I looked at the hallway walls. I looked at the place where the mirror had been. I said that I understood she was upset and that I was sorry. The timing of this had caused her distress. And I meant the second part of that, because I am not someone who is indifferent to my sister's distress, even in the circumstances we were currently standing in. My father said that Sienna was right about the renovations and that they had invested significantly in the property in good faith, and that if I proceeded with this, they would be filing a civil claim against me for the full cost of the work done, and that the claim would cover the kitchen and the garden and the repainting and the new flooring in the sitting room, and that I should understand that the courts looked very seriously at the kind of behavior I was displaying. I opened my folder. I took out the document that Mr. Vance had prepared, and I placed it on the hallway table, which was the one piece of furniture I recognized from my grandmother's time. And I said that I wanted to draw their attention to Clause 7 of the trust deed, which Mr. Vance had annotated for clarity. And I said that the trust had named my parents as interim custodial trustees from the date of my grandmother's death until the date of the trust's maturity, and that the duties of a custodial trustee included the preservation of the trust asset in its existing condition, and that any material alterations to the property required the written consent of the beneficiary, and that no such consent had been sought or given, and that the alterations Sienna had described, which included a new kitchen and landscaping and repainting and new flooring, constituted a breach of the custodial trustee's duties under the terms of the trust, and that the legal consequence of that breach was that the cost of any alterations made without consent was the liability of the trustees personally, and not a claim against the beneficiary, and that a civil claim for the renovation costs filed by my parents would in fact be a claim filed by the people who were liable for those costs against the person to whom they were liable, and that Mr. Vance had described this to me as an unlikely litigation strategy. My father looked at the document. He looked at my mother. My mother looked at Sienna. Sienna had stopped crying. The hallway was very quiet. I took out the second document, which was the formal notice of required vacation, and I held it out to Sienna, and I said that it was a 30-day notice, and that the date was on the front page, and that Mr. Vance's office was available to answer any questions about the process, and that I hoped she and Daniel would find something that suited them, and that I was sorry that it had happened this way, and I meant that too. Sienna took the document. She looked at it. She did not say anything. I picked up my folder. I walked through the hallway toward the kitchen to inspect the rest of the property, and my footsteps on the new flooring made a sound that was different from the sound I remembered, and I noticed that too, and I noted it, and I kept walking. The first 2 weeks of the 30-day notice passed in the way that difficult periods pass when you have decided in advance how you are going to move through them, which is one day at a time and without looking too far ahead, and I went to work, and I came home, and I made my tea, and I sat at my kitchen table in my rented flat, and I listened to my phone, and my phone was very busy in those 2 weeks, and I want to tell you about the quality of that noise, because I think it is important to describe it accurately. It began with my Aunt Comfort, who called on the evening of the first day, and who is my father's elder sister, and who has always understood her role in the family as the person who reminds everyone what the family requires of them, and she said that she had heard what I had done, and that she was calling because she loved me, and because she wanted me to understand that what I was doing to Sienna was not the behavior of a woman who had been raised correctly, and that my grandmother Rose would be ashamed. And I listened to all of it, and I said that I appreciated her calling and that I hoped she was well. And I ended the call. Then my cousin Abina called, and then my mother's brother called from Accra. And then two cousins I had not spoken to in 4 years called on the same evening within an hour of each other. And the calls had a consistency to them that told me they had been organized rather than spontaneous, and the organization had my mother's quality, which is thorough and social, and designed to produce in the recipient the feeling of being surrounded. And I recognized the design, and I let each call come, and I answered each one with the same quality of voice, and I said what I had to say, which was very little, and I listened to what they had to say, which was a great deal, and I noted the things that were said that I thought might be useful. Later on the 9th day, my mother organized the intervention. I was at my desk at work when my phone showed her number and I answered. And there was the specific quality of sound that tells you a phone is on speaker before anyone says anything, which is a slight distance in the voice and a background that is too quiet. And my mother said my name, and then 3 other voices said my name. And I recognized my Aunt Comfort and my mother's sister and a woman whose voice I placed after a moment as a family friend who had known us since I was small. And my mother said that they were all there because they loved me and because they were worried about me and because they wanted to help me understand what I was doing to this family. I put my own phone on speaker. I placed it on my desk. I opened the recording application that I had downloaded on the first day of the 30-day notice, and I pressed record and I listened. My mother said that Sienna was newly married and that Daniel was trying to establish himself, and that the house was the only stability they had, and that I was taking it from them out of spite, and that this was not who she had raised me to be. And my Aunt Comfort said that property was not worth a family. And my mother's sister said that I needed to think about what I was gaining and what I was losing, and the family friend said that Rose would not have wanted this. And I listened to all 4 voices saying variations of these things for 22 minutes. And then I said that I appreciated them calling, and that I had to return to my work, and that Mr. Vance's office was available for any legal questions about the process. And I ended the call. I saved the recording. I labeled the file with the date and the time and the names of the participants, and I added it to the folder on my laptop that contained every other recording from the previous 9 days, which were 11 calls and 3 voicemails and 1 letter delivered to my workplace by hand. I want to tell you about what Mr. Vance had found, because I think it is the part of this story that changed the quality of my silence from something that was simply patient into something that was a different temperature entirely. When my grandmother Rose had died, she had left not only the house in trust, but a small monthly stipend to be administered by my parents as trustees. And the stipend had a specific designated purpose, which was written into the trust documentation. And the purpose was the funding of my higher education. And the stipend had been paid by the estate into a trustee account every month for 3 years, following my grandmother's death, which was the period of my undergraduate degree. And Mr. Vance had requested the trustee account statements as part of the standard documentation review. And what the statements showed was that the stipend had been received in full every month for 3 years, and that the withdrawals from the trustee account did not correspond to any payment made to my university or to any accommodation provider or to any educational institution in any form, and that the withdrawals had been made in cash and in transfers to my parents' joint account, and Mr. Vance had cross-referenced the amounts and the dates with other financial records. And what he had found was that during the 3 years of my undergraduate degree, My parents had paid for Sienna's second and third years at a private secondary school and had taken 2 family holidays that had not included me because I had been at university. And the costs of the school fees and the holidays corresponded closely to the amounts withdrawn from the trustee account each year. I read Mr. Vance's summary. 3 times I sat with it for a day. Then I wrote an email. The email was addressed to the family group, which is a distribution list my mother had created years ago for the purpose of sharing news and photographs and updates, and which contained 31 email addresses, including my Aunt Comfort and my mother's sister and the family friend and all of the cousins who had called and all of the relatives who had not called yet but had been part of the organized silence that I understood was also a form of pressure. The email had no introduction and no explanation. It contained 3 attachments. The first was the trust deed showing the stipend clause and its designated purpose. The second was the trustee account statements for the 3 years of my degree. The third was a summary table that Mr. Vance had prepared, showing the withdrawals alongside the corresponding expenditures on Sienna's school fees and the family holidays with the dates aligned in parallel columns. I pressed send. I closed my laptop. I made tea. I sat in the quiet of my flat, and I listened to the silence that followed the email, which was a different quality of silence from any of the previous silences, and it had the specific quality of 31 people receiving the same information simultaneously and not knowing what to say about it. And the silence lasted for the rest of that evening and through the night and into the following morning, and I sat inside it, and I let it be what it was. On the morning after the email, I looked at my calendar, 5 days remaining. I drank my tea. I was ready. I woke at 5:30 on the morning. The notice expired, and I lay in the bed for a few minutes in the dark, and I listened to the rain which had started sometime in the night, and was the particular kind of rain that arrives in England without drama and simply continues. And I thought about my grandmother Rose, and I thought about the specific quality of her patience, which was not the patience of a person waiting for something to happen, but the patience of a person who has already made something happen and is simply waiting for time to catch up with the decision. And I got up and I dressed and I made my tea and I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at the folder that Mr. Vance had prepared for today, and I went through it one final time, not because I needed to check anything, but because thoroughness is a habit, and habits do not pause for significant days. I had spoken to Mr. Vance's office on Friday, and they had confirmed that Sienna and Daniel had not contacted them and had not made any communication indicating their intention to vacate, and that the enforcement order which had been filed with the court on day 22 of the notice period had been granted without challenge, and that the bailiffs and the locksmith were confirmed for 9. And that I should arrive no earlier than 8:55 and park on the opposite side of the road from the driveway and wait for the enforcement officers to position themselves before I approached the property. I left my flat at 8:15. The drive took 35 minutes in the rain, and I parked on the opposite side of the road at 8:52, and I turned the engine off, and I sat in the quiet of the car, and I looked at the house through the rain on the windscreen, and the curtains were drawn on every window, and my father's car, and Sienna's car, and Daniel's car were all in the driveway. And I noted that, and I sat with my folder on the passenger seat, and I waited. The bailiffs arrived at 9 exactly in a white transit van, and the locksmith arrived 40 seconds behind them in a smaller van with the company name on the side. And they parked behind me, and I watched in the mirror as 2 enforcement officers got out, and I got out of my car, and I walked to meet them, and they confirmed the address and confirmed the order number, and I showed them my copy of the enforcement order and the title register, and the senior officer said that they would approach the property first. and that I should remain at the pavement until they had made initial contact. I stood at the pavement in the rain. The senior officer knocked at the door. Nothing happened for a long moment, and then the curtain in the front room moved, and then nothing happened again. And the officer knocked a second time and announced their presence and their authority. And I stood on the pavement and I waited, and the rain continued in its steady and indifferent way. I heard the car before I saw it. My parents' car came around the corner at a speed that was not my father's usual speed, and it pulled up behind the locksmith's van. And my father got out before the engine had fully stopped. And my mother got out from the passenger side, and my father looked at the bailiffs, and looked at the locksmith's van, and looked at me, and his face had the color it had had on the morning I had come to inspect the house, except more so. And he walked toward me, and he said that I needed to stop this right now, and that he was not going to stand on his mother's street and watch his daughter do this to his family. I said good morning. He said that he had contacted a journalist the previous evening, and that if I proceeded with this, he would ensure that the story was in the press and that I would be known as the woman who evicted her pregnant sister. And I want to tell you that the word pregnant was the first I had heard of this. And I looked at my mother, and my mother looked at the ground, and I understood that this information had been held back and was being deployed now as the final available instrument. And I stood in the rain, and I thought about it. And I thought about my grandmother, and I thought about a trust deed, and I thought about 31 years of watching and deciding, and I looked at my father. I said nothing for a moment. Then I reached into the folder and I took out the enforcement order, and I held it out. And I said that this was the signed execution order from the High Court, and that it had been granted on day 22 of the notice period, and that the notice period had now expired, and that the enforcement was lawful, and that a journalist who reviewed the documentation would find a straightforward case of trust law being correctly applied, and that I wished him luck with the call. My mother said that Sienna was under enormous stress, and that stress in early pregnancy was dangerous, and that I was her sister. And she said the word sister the way she had never said the word sister to me before, which was as though it meant something that should cost me something. And I looked at her and I said that I was sorry to hear about the pregnancy, and that I hoped Sienna was well, and that the 30-day notice had provided sufficient time to make alternative arrangements, and that if Sienna needed additional support with the logistics of the move, Mr. Vance's office could provide a list of resources. My father said that he would call the media. I said that was his choice. The front door opened. Sienna was standing in the doorway, and she was in her dressing gown, and her face had the specific look of a person who has spent 30 days believing that something will not happen and has just understood in a single moment that it is happening. And she looked at the bailiffs, and she looked at the locksmith, and she looked at me standing on the pavement with the rain on my coat and my folder under my arm. And she said, my name, and the way she said it was different from every other way she had said it in our lives. And what was in it was not anger and not performance, and was something that I recognized as the sound of a person meeting a reality they had genuinely not believed was coming. She said, how can you do this? I said that she had had 30 days and that Mr. Vance's office had been available throughout, and that I hoped she and Daniel had been able to make arrangements. She began to cry. The senior bailiff stepped forward and explained to Sienna in the measured tone of a person who has done this many times that they were authorized to enter the property and oversee the vacation of the occupants, and that they would provide reasonable time for personal belongings to be gathered, and that the process would be conducted with dignity. And he said the word dignity. And I thought about my father's letter and the word dignity in the 3rd paragraph. And I thought about how often that word appears in situations where it is already gone. The locksmith walked past me toward the door. Sienna stepped back. The bailiff stepped through. I walked to the threshold of my grandmother's house, and I stood there and I looked at my father on the driveway with the rain on his coat, and my mother beside him with her hand over her mouth, and Sienna in the hallway in her dressing gown, and Daniel somewhere behind her. And I stood in the doorway of the house that Rose had sat in for 53 years, and I did not say anything. I had been saying nothing for 2 years. I was very good at it by now. The last moving box left the house at 11:43, and I know the time because I was standing at the window of the front room watching, and I have always known the time of things that matter. And the removals company that Daniel had arranged were efficient and professional, and they had done their work without drama, and the van pulled away from the curb, and I watched it go. And then I looked at my parents. They were standing on the pavement beside my father's car, and they were not speaking to each other, and they were not speaking to me. And my father was looking at the middle distance in the way that men look at the middle distance when they have run out of the thing that usually powers them. And my mother was looking at the house, and her face had a quality to it that I had not seen before, which was not grief and not anger, and was something quieter than both of those things, and was the face of a person who has arrived at the end of a version of events they had been constructing for a long time and found that the ending is not the one they wrote. I did not go to them. I turned from the window and I walked through the empty front room and into the empty hallway, and I stood in the hallway of my grandmother's house, and I listened to the silence, and I want to tell you about that silence because it was different from every other silence I had stood in inside that house. And what made it different was its quality, which was not the silence of absence and was not the silence of something missing, and was the clean and specific silence of a space that has been returned to its correct condition after a period of being something else. And I stood in it and I breathed it. And it was the first full breath I had taken inside that house since I walked through the door on the morning of the inspection. I went upstairs. I walked past the bathroom that had been retiled in a style my grandmother would not have chosen, and past the second bedroom that had been repainted and recarpeted. And I walked to the end of the landing, and I opened the door to my grandmother's bedroom, and I went inside. The room was empty as the others were empty, and the wardrobe that ran along the left wall was the original wardrobe that Rose had put in the room 30 years ago, and which Sienna had not replaced because it was built in and because removing it would have required more disruption than even Sienna had been willing to undertake. And I crossed the room and I opened the wardrobe and I looked at the empty rail and the empty shelves, and then I looked at the back left corner of the lower shelf where the wood met the side panel, and I pressed it the way Rose had shown me once when I was 9 years old, and she had said that every house needs a place that only one person knows about, and the panel released, and behind it was the compartment that Rose had used for the things she wanted to keep safe. And inside the compartment was a single envelope, and the envelope had my name on it, in her handwriting. I sat down on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom. I opened the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages written in Rose's hand, which was small and precise and had not changed between the letter I had seen when I was young and the letter I was holding now, and I want to read you what she said, because I think it is the part of this story that makes everything else make sense. She said that she was writing the letter to be read after the trust had matured, and that she hoped I had used the time well, and that she suspected I had, because she had always known the kind of person I was, which was the same kind of person she was, which was someone who watches and waits and does the work quietly and trusts that the structure will hold. If you build it correctly, she said that she wanted me to understand why she had built it the way she had, and she said that the house was not simply a preference and was not simply the natural choice of a grandmother who had observed favoritism and wanted to correct it. And she said that there was something I needed to know about the other savings. She said that she had kept for 30 years a separate savings account that she had intended to leave equally to both her grandchildren, and that she had told my parents about the account because she had trusted them to manage it as interim trustees after her death alongside the house trust. And she said that 3 years before she died, she had asked her solicitor to review the account. And the review had found that my parents had been making withdrawals from the account for 7 years, and that the balance at the point of review was less than a quarter of what it should have been, and that the withdrawals had funded things she listed carefully in the letter, which were a car and 2 extensions to my parents' own home, and the school fees and the holidays that Mr. Vance had already found in the trustee account records, and several other things that I had not known about. She said that she had understood at that point that by the time she died, there would be nothing left in the savings account to leave either of us, and that the house was the only asset she had that was protected by its own legal structure, and that she had made the decision to place it in trust for me alone. Not because she loved me more than Sienna, but because Sienna had parents who would always find a way to provide for her, even if the provision came at someone else's expense. And I had parents who would always find a way to consume whatever was meant for me. And she said that the house was not a gift and was a shield, and that she hoped I would use it as one. She said that she was proud of me. She said to take my time. I sat on the floor of her bedroom for a long time. Then I folded the letter and I put it in my coat pocket, and I got up and I went downstairs and I went through each room one final time, and I looked at what Sienna and Daniel had made of my grandmother's house. And I thought about the rose bushes along the path. And I thought about the mirror in the hallway. And I thought about the color of the walls that was gone. And I thought about all the things that can be unmade by people who do not understand what they are touching. Then I took out my phone and I called the letting agency. The agent I had been speaking to for 3 weeks answered, and I said that the property was vacant and ready for viewing, and that I wanted to proceed with the young couple she had mentioned, who were both in their first jobs and were looking for a stable home, and who had written a letter with their application about what having a secure tenancy would mean to them. And the agent said that she had hoped I would choose them. And I said that I thought my grandmother would have approved, and the agent said she would arrange everything. I walked to the kitchen. I placed the key on the counter. I stood in the kitchen where Rose had made tea and placed a document on a table and changed everything with patience and precision and silence. And I thought about what silence actually is when it is used correctly, which is not the absence of power, and is the presence of it in its most concentrated and undiluted form. And I thought about 2 years of saying nothing, while the people around me said everything. And I thought about a trust deed and a hidden envelope and a shield built by a woman who understood that the most important thing she could leave someone was not wealth, but protection from the people who would take it. I turned off the kitchen light. I walked to the front door. I opened it. I stepped outside. I pulled the door closed behind me. My parents' car was gone. The street was quiet, and the rain had stopped, and the morning had the clean quality that mornings have after rain, which is everything washed and the light sitting differently on the ordinary surfaces of things. And I stood on the path where the rose bushes had been, and I breathed the air, and I thought about Rose. And I thought about a 9-year-old girl being shown a hidden compartment and being told that every house needs a place that only one person knows about. And I thought that she had been right about that. And about most things, silence is not weakness. It is not surrender. and it is not fear, and it is not the sound of someone who has nothing to say, and it is the sound of someone who has everything to say, and has chosen the moment with care, and has built the structure correctly, and has waited for the weight to be placed on it, and has watched it hold. If you believe that justice was served here today, then leave a comment below and tell me, because I read every single one, and the ones that come from people who have been the shield in their own family and who have never been thanked for it are the ones I carry with me. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now, because every story on here is built the same way, which is carefully and quietly and with the complete belief that the truth is worth waiting for. And if this gave you something today, a like costs nothing, and it helps this reach the person who is currently in year 1 of their own 2 years of silence and needs to know that the structure will hold, and I will see you in the next story.